Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online worship service. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister. Today in worship, I'm joined by our Assistant Minister, the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, Alma Vizcarra, our Membership and Communications Coordinator, Alex Kemming, our Family Ministry Coordinator, and our Business Administrator, Tawana Grice. Our music today comes from our Music Director, Mark Vogel, and the composer, Kevin M. Kennedy. Kevin's piece, Converts Them, is the first of several that we have commissioned from contemporary artists as a way to support the arts during this time of pandemic. My sermon title is Abolition Democracy. In it, I reflect on what will be necessary for lasting change to come from this time of widespread protest against police brutality and white supremacy. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. And for those of you who are located in Houston, an invitation. Now, through at least the end of July, we will be maintaining a daily vigil in solidarity with Black Lives Matter from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. outside of our Museum District campus. I hope that you will consider participating. If you would like to join it, please email info@firstuuhouston.org to sign up. We hope that you find our worship a source of comfort and clarity, and we invite you to join us each week for as long as we remain primarily online and in person as soon as it is safe for us to gather again. I invite you now to hear our call to worship.
When the summer clouds of thought bring the long-awaited rain, and the thirsty soil is moistened and the grass is green again, then I long for summer sunshine. But I know that clouds and tears are a part of life's refreshment, like the rainbow's hopes and fears. Welcome to all the diverse rainbow of people who have joined us this morning. Welcome those celebrating the solstice, those celebrating fatherhood, and those celebrating pride. Welcome those who have previously joined us in person and those who have only joined us online. We assemble together in community once more. We who acknowledge the inherent worth and dignity of every person welcome you. Unitarian and Universalist churches have welcomed multiracial congregants for centuries and have welcomed sexual minorities for decades. On this day, we welcome the diverse rainbow of people who have joined us this morning. We join in love and community. Come, let us worship together.
Celebremos compartiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz. When the summer sun is shining over golden land and sea, and the flowers in the hedgerow welcome butterfly and bee, then my open heart is glowing, full of warmth for everyone, and I feel an inner beauty which reflects the summer sun. When the summer clouds of thunder bring the long-awaited rain, and the thirsty soil is moistened and the grass is green again, then I long for summer sunshine, but I know that clouds and tears are a part of life's refreshment, like the rainbow's hopes and fears. In the cool of summer evening, when the dancing insects play, and in garden, street, and meadow linger echoes of the day. Then my heart is full of yearning, hopes and memories flood the whole of my being, reaching inwards to the corners of my soul.
Please join me in the spirit that some call meditation and others name prayer. Make yourself comfortable, relax, connect to your body. Take one deep breath and then another. Open your mind, open your heart. Spirit of life and love, God of many names and mystery beyond all our naming. Today, we name you the God who leads us to acknowledge and celebrate the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Today, we name you the God who implores us to fight for justice and equity and show compassion in all our relationships. We lift up our grieving hearts to you. The news is filled with those who must fight for their lives because of the color of their skin, and those who must struggle to live into the truth of who they are. We mourn that 2 more transgender women have been murdered, and that from coast to coast, Black men are found hanging from trees. We mourn. The news is filled with those who must fight for their rights because of whom they love or where they're from, and those fighting and mourning the effects of the pandemic. We mourn that plans to again allow discrimination in healthcare against people who are transgender were recently announced. But we rejoice that the Supreme Court this week ruled that LGBTQ people have nationwide protection from workplace discrimination, and that DACA immigrants are protected from deportation, at least for a while. We name you as the God who strengthens the families of all those hurt and killed by violence, those wrongly imprisoned, the God who celebrates love and diversity, the God who comforts all those who have fallen ill and mourns with all the families of those who have died because of the pandemic. Spirit of life, remind us daily that we are to celebrate and protect the inherent worth and dignity of every person, that we are to fight for justice and equity, and we are to show compassion. We pray in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We pray in the names of all helpers of humankind. May the congregation, absent in body, though present in spirit, say Amen. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. I invite you now to say the name or bring to mind those you wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the mystery that is life, in the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion. I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
us through our journey. This is my prayer. This is my prayer. This is my prayer.
Over the next 4 weeks, our shared offering will go to sustain local organizations that are working to address police brutality and build power in Houston's Black community. The shared offering will be split between the Texas Organizing Project, an organization that has been coordinating bail funds for Texas protesters, the SHAPE Center, one of Houston's longest-standing community centers, and the Seha Youth and Fitness Center, which provides health and fitness programs. This is a crucial time for movements for justice. We ask that you consider making a generous donation. Last week, we held our annual Inspiration Sunday. Since many of you are not taking vacations this year because of the pandemic, we ask that you consider giving the congregation half of what you would have spent on a vacation. We now ask that you consider giving the other half during the next 4 weeks of our shared offering. Is it a lot to ask? Yes. Will it make a difference? We certainly hope so. Will whatever you give this morning, whether it's $1 or $1,000, be greatly appreciated? Most definitely. An offering will now be gratefully received.
For My People by Margaret Walker. For my people, everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties, and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people, lending their strength to the years, to the gone years, and the now years, and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama backyards, playing, baptizing, and preaching, and doctor, and jail, and soldier, and school, and mama, and cooking, and playhouse, and concert, and store, and hair, and Miss Chumby and company. For the cramped, bewildered years, we went to school to learn to know the reasons why, and the answers to, and the people who, and the places where, and the days when, in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were Black, and poor, and small, and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things, to be man and woman, and to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and success, to marry their playmates and bear children and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York, and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, inherited, dispossessed, and happy people filling the cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets, and needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all our own. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled, entangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. For my people blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and the clubs of societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by facile force of state and fad and novelty, by false prophet and holy believer. For my people standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control.
I'm Angela Davis, Abolition Democracy, Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture. When I refer to prison abolitionism, I draw from the DuBoisian notion of abolition democracy. It is not only about abolition as a negative process of tearing down, it is also about building up, about creating new institutions. Although DuBois referred very specifically to slavery and its legal disestablishment as an economic institution, his observation that this negative process by itself was insufficient has deep resonances for prison abolition today. DuBois pointed out that in order to fully abolish the oppressive conditions produced by slavery, new democratic institutions would have to be created. Because this did not occur, Black people encountered new forms of slavery, from debt peonage and the convict lease system to segregated and second-class education. The prison system continues to carry out this terrible legacy. It has become a receptacle for all of those human beings who bear the inheritance of the failure to create abolition democracy in the aftermath of slavery. And this inheritance is not only borne by Black prisoners, but by poor Latino, Native American, Asian, and white prisoners.
Today's sermon is being recorded the day after Juneteenth. This is Father's Day weekend, and it also includes the summer solstice. We are in the midst of the largest protest waves against police brutality and white supremacy since the 1960s. We just witnessed a historic Supreme Court case that extended the 1964 Civil Rights Act to the LGBTQ community. And we continue to live in the middle of a pandemic that to date has cost 120,000 lives here in the United States and left almost 500,000 people dead throughout the world. Many of us are residing in Texas, a state in which the case count and the hospitalization rate continue to climb. and we're on the verge of what most likely will be the most consequential presidential election since 1860, an election whose outcome will likely impact not just the future of this country, but the future of humanity. It's impossible to address all of those topics in a single sermon. Just as, I have to admit, it feels almost impossible to live through them. Many of you, I imagine, are feeling like I am right now, exhausted. Exhausted by the difficulty of navigating through a pandemic that requires, for safety's sake, you to wear a mask anytime you go to a store. A pandemic that precludes us from holding in-person worship services for fear of spreading the virus. A pandemic that has brought with it mass unemployment, waves of eviction, and social isolation. Exhausted by living in a society where police brutality to date has cost 481 people at least their lives this year and destroyed the lives of uncounted numbers of others. Exhausted by continuing to live with the horrors of racism and white supremacy, and exhausted by what appears to be an almost daily assault on constitutional democracy run by a political order that can best be described as white supremacist populism. This morning, in the middle of everything, I want to offer you reflections on two intertwined topics that might help you as individuals and us as a religious community make a little sense of it all. The first is conversion. The second is abolition democracy. My argument is simple. The present moment offers us as a society and us as individuals the possibility of converting to abolition democracy. Abolition democracy is, in the words of Angela Davis, the understanding that in order to fully abolish the oppressive conditions produced by slavery, new democratic institutions would have to be created. The United States had the opportunity to convert to abolition democracy after the original Juneteenth and squandered it. The United States had the opportunity to undergo such a transformation during the civil rights era. That did not happen. The United States and all of its residents now have such an opportunity again. The chance to undergo what Martin Luther King Jr. called a radical revolution of values cannot be squandered again. Conversion is a subject that many Unitarian Universalists find uncomfortable. The 20th century Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams defined conversion as a fundamental change of heart and will. Conversion occurs when an individual experiences a crisis, often described as a division in the self or the soul, and then undergoes a resolution to that crisis. We might think of it as a transformation of the soul, by which I mean the core of our being, our deepest sense of self, from one state to another. Amazing grace. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see, runs the classic hymn, attesting to the power of the conversion experience. Conversion is usually thought of as an emotional, sudden rupture. The poor soul, the sinner, awakes from one moment to the next. Was blind, but now I see, claims the ableist language. Historically, Unitarians have been suspicious of such conversion narratives. The dawn of the 20th century, the philosopher William James describes religions that encourage conversion experiences as religions of the twice-born. Unitarians were, in his estimation, one of the once-born kinds of religions, in which a type of consciousness developing straight and natural with no element of morbid compunction or crisis was encouraged. This, he claimed, led our religious ancestors to possess a temperament weighted on the side of cheer and fatally forbidden to linger over the darker aspects of the universe. The once-born, he believed, were cursed with an inability to feel evil. Now, I'm not sure about that. What I am sure of is that a lot of people seem to be undergoing conversion experiences right now. The historic protests against the police brutality and white supremacy have woken numerous people up to what has long amounted to the permanent crisis of racial injustice in this country and in the world. A number of corporations and celebrities with little previous track record on racial justice are suddenly proclaiming Black Lives Matter. After apparently blackballing civil rights activist and quarterback Colin Kaepernick, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell is now saying Black Lives Matter and claiming, I personally protest with you and want to be part of the much-needed change in this country. Big companies are making statements like Amazon stands in solidarity with the black community, or in the case of YouTube, we need to stand in solidarity against racism and violence. When members of our community are hurt, we are all hurt. Accompanying these words are token financial donations. Amazon is giving $10 million to well-known civil rights and community organizations like the NAACP and ACLU, a fraction of the money that they've made during this pandemic. YouTube is donating $1 million. The clothing company The Gap is making a donation of $250,000 to, quote, fight against racial injustice, alongside a statement, for 50 years, we've committed to standing with our employees, customers, and communities to be a force for good. I have to question the commitment of these corporations. Racism, or what we could name the structures of white supremacy, did not emerge on the scene with George Floyd's death. It arrived on this continent more than 400 years ago with the European colonial powers. Many of the companies I named continue to thrive off the exploitation of poor people of color. At the same time that Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos was making donations and encouraging office workers to observe Juneteenth by taking, quote, some time to learn, reflect, and support each other, unquote, the company is mounting a vigorous anti-union campaign against warehouse workers. Labor unions, I might mention, have repeatedly been an important vehicle for working-class people, often people of color, to build wealth and secure safety on their jobs. And Amazon notably fired Christian Smalls, a black warehouse worker, for organizing during the pandemic. The Gap, despite its claim to, quote, be a force for good, has long practiced sweatshop labor. Citing a Human Rights Watch report as recently as 2015, the journalist Patrick Wynn could accuse the company of essentially manufacturing its clothing under conditions that amounted to modern-day slavery in Cambodia. I could go on. But instead, let me just observe that the amount of money that these companies are pledging to racial injustice is not even a fraction of their advertising budgets, let alone a fraction of their historic profits. More troublingly, their statements about racial injustice are not accompanied by pledges to significantly transform their corporate culture or work in any meaningful way toward the dismantling of white supremacy and structural or systemic racism within the United States. Mostly, though, this widespread apparent conversion to anti-racism reminds me of a sentence written by the 19th century Boston industrialist and social reformer Amos Adams Lawrence. Writing on June 1st, 1854, Lawrence observed, "We went to bed one night and waked up stark mad abolitionists." We waked up stark mad abolitionists. Lawrence made his claim of personal and collective transformation, his statement about conversion, on the eve of what appeared to be a historic world-changing event. We waked up stark mad abolitionists. Lawrence's words reflect a moment when suddenly, overnight, from one morning to the next, white liberals in the North rejected portions of their long-standing compact with slaveholders in the South. We waked up stark mad abolitionists. Lawrence's words could seemingly reflect the attitudes of many people who, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, have suddenly become aware of the gross inequities of the prison system and stark brutality of the police. In the last weeks, we've seen a shift as apparently rapid as the one Lawrence observed in his own time. Lawrence was reacting to the rendition of Anthony Burns. Burns was an enslaved black man who escaped from Virginia to Boston in 1853. 3 years prior, Congress had adopted the Fugitive Slave Law. It required that escaped slaves anywhere in the United States be returned to bondage. It also criminalized anyone who offered harbor or aid to escaped slaves. Boston was at the time a hotbed of abolitionist activity. Abolitionists were, however, for the most part viewed as too radical and too strident for the majority of the city's leadership. The abolitionist minister Theodore Parker, for example, was so despised by his more moderate Unitarian colleagues that they refused to exchange pulpits with him. Lawrence belonged to the group who viewed abolitionists with suspicion for being too radical and divisive. Towards the end of May 1854, Burns was walking along a street in Boston when he was recognized as a fugitive slave. In a scene that resonates far too much with the experiences of many black people of today, according to eyewitnesses, he was assaulted by 6 ruffians who charged him with having broken into a jeweler's shop. They seized him, forced him to the courthouse, where he was surrounded by men armed with bludgeons and revolvers. Now, there's no evidence that Burns was ever involved in any theft of a jewelry store, but the next day he was put on trial without the benefit of counsel and found to be a fugitive slave. Burns was sentenced to be returned to bondage. Abolitionists like Parker and Thomas James, who had himself escaped from slavery, vowed that they would not let Burns be taken back to Virginia. An attempt was made to storm the jail where he was being kept. A deputy U.S. Marshal was killed, but law enforcement retained control of Burns. Boston was effectively placed under martial law. A few days later, the streets lined with thousands of federal troops. In full view of an outraged populace, Burns was marched in shackles onto a ship that returned him to slavery. The event woke men like Lawrence, who had previously turned a willful eye away from the horrors of the chattel slavery system to its brutality. He and numerous others waked up stark mad abolitionists and rejected their belief that preserving the Union with the South was more important than abolishing slavery. Lawrence began to devote his considerable fortune to the abolitionist cause. At the same time, he appears not to have changed his business practices. His family operated textile mills, and its fortune was largely built by turning cotton, picked by enslaved people in the South, into finished products. Now, that might be a minor note. It's not what troubles me about Lawrence's sentence. Where I find myself troubled with Lawrence's sentence is when I place it in dialogue with another sentence written by an abolitionist some 18 years later. It was spoken by a white Northerner, the newspaper publisher Horace Greeley. He said, "I was, in the days of slavery, an enemy of slavery because I thought slavery inconsistent with rights, the dignity, the highest well-being of free labor. That might have been a mistake." We waked up stark, mad abolitionists. That might have been a mistake. In many ways, it is the legacy of these 2 sentences, composed by 2 different men, 2 decades apart, that we are contending with today. Lawrence penned his sentence before the Civil War, prior to emancipation, in advance of Juneteenth and the abolition of slavery. He made his statement about conversion when the structures of white supremacy were firmly in place. Greeley spoke his words after they had been disrupted, in the midst of Reconstruction, when white supremacy could no longer be taken for granted, when it appeared that it might actually be dismantled. In the aftermath of the Civil War, white people like Greeley became what the historian David Blight has called reconciliationists. Rather than wanting to build a society in which structures of white supremacy were dismantled, they sought to heal the wounds between the white North and white South. Rather than justice, they wanted peace. The great philosopher W.E.B. DuBois counterposed their vision with what he called abolition democracy. DuBois summarized it in deceptively simple terms. Abolition democracy was based on freedom, intelligence, and power for all men. Now, he wrote those words in 1931. If he were alive today, I am sure he would have rephrased them to include women and the transgendered. After the Civil War, proponents of abolition democracy demanded full legal rights for the formerly enslaved. They also demanded what we might now call reparations for slavery. They recognized that political freedom is essentially meaningless without economic autonomy. When your entire livelihood is dependent upon an employer or some landlord, it can seem impossible to vote and act for your own interests. Alongside political freedom and economic independence, abolition Democrats worked for a third thing: universal free public education. They understood that in order for democracy to function, community members had to be educated enough to identify and advocate for their own interests. They had to be able to distinguish truth from falsehood, knowledge from propaganda. In Du Bois's view, the success of abolition democracy required confronting what he called the American assumption, This is the false belief that, quote, wealth is mainly the result of its owner's efforts and that any average worker can by thrift become a capitalist, unquote. It is the lie that each of us, if we work just hard enough, can become fantastically wealthy. It is a refusal to recognize that much of the wealth of the world has been built upon bloody exploitation, the denial by companies like Amazon and Gap, or individuals like Amos Adams Lawrence, that their very success is closely tied to maintaining the structures of white supremacy. Abolition democracy, Du Bois argued, was an effort led by people of color, but it benefited everyone. Poor and working people of all colors, he maintained, benefited from free public schools. They would have benefited, he argued, from the redistribution of wealth of white plantation owners and slave masters in the South. In his magnificent text, Black Reconstruction in America, Du Bois meticulously documented how chattel slavery had not been ended through the efforts of the white Union Army of the North. It was destroyed when, over the course of the Civil War, the enslaved African peoples of the South engaged in a, quote, general strike against slavery. They withdrew their labor from the Confederacy and then offered it to the Union. It was this withdrawal and bestowal of labor that decided the war, he observed. Du Bois wrote his book after a period when white supremacy had gone through a major retrenchment, after, in his words, a new slavery had been built. It was a time when histories of the Civil War and Reconstruction were being written that tried to show that the war had been about states' rights and not slavery, and that abolition democracy had been a failure. Du Bois wanted the world to understand, as it must be understood today on this Sunday after Juneteenth, when people around the world are rising up against police brutality and white supremacy, that for 4 long and fearful years, the South fought to perpetuate human slavery. He wanted to propagate the truth that abolition democracy, empowered and led by formerly enslaved people of African descent, achieved a democracy for the working millions that was the finest which the world has ever seen. Black people, Du Bois wanted everyone to understand, in the years following the Civil War, had proclaimed, in the words of poet Margaret Walker, "Let a new earth arise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control." And Du Bois needed people to know that in issuing such a proclamation, Black people in the United States had invited everyone to join them in creating this new earth. It is here, as we move to the end, that we return to the subject of conversion. While William James was suspicious of the ability of the once-born, people who had never undergone a conversion experience, to be aware of evil, I, good Unitarian preacher that I am suspicious of sudden conversions. I worry about their durability. Far too many people who, in the words of Amos Adams Lawrence, waked up stark, mad abolitionists in 1854, sought reconciliation with the South in the 1870s. Indeed, the story of the collapse of Reconstruction is as much the story of Northern whites like Horace Greeley deciding that they were mistaken and coming to believe that they had more in common with Southern white elites than with working people of color. My own anti-racist journey, such that it is, has been marked by no sudden conversion moments. I am decidedly once born. Instead of undergoing a fundamental change of heart and will, I was blessed to have been raised in a multiracial community where civil rights activists inspired me at an early age. I grew up down the street from the Reverend John Washington, one of the Freedom Riders and an anti-apartheid activist. And I've spent my entire adult life learning from anti-racist organizers, many who have been people of color, and spent countless hours researching the social construction of race and the history and structures of white supremacy. I do not offer this brief testimony to cast myself as any kind of hero. My own life has been marred by many failures, and there are certain things that I am not proud of. In truth, I could preach a whole year's worth of uncomfortable sermons on how I have benefited from and continue to benefit from structures of white supremacy. Instead, I mention my testimony to suggest that anti-racism, especially for those of you who have what one of my friends likes to call the complexion connection, is the work of a lifetime. If you're someone who waked up a stark mad abolitionist in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, the question for you is not, just as the question is not for me, what anti-racist action will you take tomorrow? The question is, what anti-racist action will you take 20 years from now? In the 19th century, when confronted with the possibility that white supremacy would be dismantled, men like Horace Greeley ultimately decided that they were mistaken, that they were not abolitionists after all. They might have woke up stark, mad abolitionists after the rendition of Anthony Burns, but they returned to their staid, stoned, cold white supremacy once Reconstruction was underway and the abolition of their privilege was a possibility. The United States and the world have been suffering from their legacy ever since. Today, as so many people are waking up stark mad abolitionists, as protests continue to flood the streets, as the nation and the world is again having a conversation about abolition and the possibility of dismantling structures of white supremacy, the question remains, when confronted with the chance that our own privileges might be dismantled, what will those of us who are privileged but claim to be modern-day abolitionists choose? Will we go the path of Horace Greeley? Or will we choose to build, as Angela Davis, DuBois, and so many others would have us do, a genuine abolition democracy with new democratic, multiracial institutions? I leave you with those questions here in Houston, Texas, some 50 miles from Galveston, where 155 years ago, the people of Texas were informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Amen, and blessed be.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
All slaves are free. The words come down to us through the years. Let now be the time that they finally ring true, when the structures of oppression are cast aside forevermore. And in the words of Margaret Walker, a beauty full of healing and strength emerges. Go in peace, go in love, may our lives be a blessing. Amen.
While our church as buildings is closed, our church as people is still meeting, but now online. There are weekly and monthly offerings to keep you connected and engaged with our community. Please join Carol Burris this morning for reflection and sharing via Zoom at 11:30. Monday at 7 p.m., Reverend Scott will be hosting his bi-weekly office hour. You are invited to bring your thoughts, comments, and questions to this open discussion time. Join Reverend Colin Tuesday at 5 for Texts for Troubled Times, a series of literature-focused discussions. He will continue the discussion of Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor. Please go to our website, firstuuhouston.org/online-group-meetings for more details. And remember, all times shown are Central Daylight Time.